The Pacific raged with fire and fury as the American forces clashed with the Japanese in one of the most intense battles of the war. The tides of war were shifting, and the Japanese, once dominant, now found themselves facing devastating losses at the hands of the relentless American military. But how did this battle unfold, and what led to such a crushing defeat? The Japanese Empire had once seemed unstoppable, sweeping across the Pacific with lightning speed. Their forces had crushed opposition in China, the Philippines, and Southeast Asia, establishing a vast empire that stretched across the region. Their confidence soared as they expanded their control, believing their military strength was unmatched. Every victory fueled their belief that they could dominate the Pacific indefinitely. However, beneath this confidence lay a growing sense of unease. The United States, though caught off guard in the early days of the war, had begun to regroup, strategize, and prepare for a counteroffensive that would change the course of history. American military planners understood that defeating Japan would require patience, resources, and relentless pressure. They analyzed Japan's weaknesses, identifying key locations to strike. The once mighty Imperial Navy, which had dominated the seas, was now being challenged by an enemy that had superior industrial capacity and technological advancements. With each passing month, the balance of power began to shift. Japan's initial victories had been swift and overwhelming, but they had underestimated the resilience and determination of their enemy. While they had relied on well-trained pilots, skilled naval commanders, and aggressive tactics, they now faced an adversary that was adapting quickly. The Americans had learned from their early setbacks, refining their strategies and strengthening their forces. Every aircraft carrier built, every plane produced, and every soldier trained brought them closer to turning the tide. The Pacific Ocean, once controlled by Japanese fleets, became the stage for a brutal conflict where air and sea battles determined the fate of entire islands. American intelligence, strengthened by codebreakers, provided valuable insights into Japanese movements, allowing for devastatingly precise attacks. What had once been a war dominated by surprise attacks from Japan had transformed into a battle of attrition, and the Americans had the advantage of resources, manpower, and production capabilities. On the ground, the Japanese army fought with unwavering determination, adhering to their strict code of honor. They refused to surrender, choosing to fight to the last man rather than retreat. This made every battle costly for both sides, with American forces encountering fierce resistance as they advanced island by island. Despite their tenacity, the Japanese were facing an enemy that was not only well-equipped but also learning from every engagement. The losses Japan suffered were not only measured in lives, but also in morale. What had once seemed like an unbreakable empire was now under siege. Supplies ran low, fuel became scarce, and their ability to replace lost ships and aircraft dwindled. Factories back home struggled to keep up with demand, while American industry operated at full capacity, producing more planes, ships, and weapons than Japan could ever hope to match. As the battles raged on, the cracks in Japan's once formidable military became evident. Communications broke down, experienced pilots were lost, and desperation led to increasingly reckless decisions. Kamikaze attacks, once seen as a last resort, became more frequent as Japan's leadership sought any means to slow the American advance. But even these desperate measures could not stop the inevitable. For the soldiers and sailors on both sides, the war had become a relentless cycle of combat, exhaustion, and survival. The Americans, fueled by a desire to end the war and avenge the attack on Pearl Harbor, pushed forward with unyielding determination. They knew that every island taken, every ship sunk, and every plane shot down brought them closer to victory. Japan, once the aggressor, was now on the defensive, struggling to maintain control over the territories they had fought so hard to claim. The tide had turned, and no amount of bravery or sacrifice could change the reality that their empire was crumbling. The storm they had unleashed upon the Pacific was now crashing down upon them, and the cost of their ambition was proving to be devastating. The roar of American aircraft filled the skies as waves of bombers and fighters soared toward their targets. The once dominant Japanese Air Force, which had struck fear into enemies with its precision and discipline, now found itself overwhelmed. The American pilots, equipped with superior planes and enhanced tactics, engaged in relentless dogfights, taking down enemy aircraft with deadly efficiency. Each battle in the air tilted the balance further, and Japan's inability to replace its lost pilots and planes became painfully clear. The U.S. military had learned the value of air superiority, and they used it to devastating effect. With each successful mission, they crippled Japan's ability to move supplies, reinforce defenses, and launch counterattacks. The powerful American war machine, backed by an industrial force that could outproduce the enemy, ensured that the skies belonged to them. Their bombers, escorted by squadrons of fighters, rained destruction upon Japanese airfields, naval bases, and supply depots. The once proud fleet of Zero fighters, which had dominated early battles, was now being outclassed by newer, faster, and more heavily armed American aircraft. As air dominance tightened, the U.S. Navy unleashed its full strength. Massive aircraft carriers, bristling with firepower, became the spearhead of the offensive, sending wave after wave of planes deep into enemy territory. The Japanese, struggling to keep pace, watched as their fleet was slowly dismantled. Their once mighty battleships and cruisers, symbols of their naval power, were now hunted relentlessly. Every carrier lost was a devastating blow, as their ability to project force across the Pacific depended on these floating air bases. Naval battles erupted across the ocean, with American warships engaging Japanese vessels in brutal firefights. The sound of gunfire and the thunder of explosions echoed as shells ripped through steel hulls, sending ships to the depths. Submarines prowled beneath the waves, torpedoes striking enemy vessels with deadly precision. The Japanese Navy, once considered invincible, was being pushed back, unable to recover from the devastating losses it suffered in each engagement. One by one, strategic islands fell under American control. Each island taken provided a crucial stepping stone, bringing the U.S. forces closer to Japan's mainland. Airstrips were built on captured territory, allowing bombers to reach deeper into enemy lines. Japan's supply routes, once the lifeline of their war effort, were now choked off, leaving troops stranded without reinforcements or provisions. Despite their dire situation, the Japanese refused to surrender easily. Their naval commanders devised desperate strategies, launching daring nighttime assaults and using every available ship to strike back. They employed smaller, faster vessels to evade American firepower, attempting to inflict as much damage as possible. However, the sheer strength of the U.S. fleet proved overwhelming. American destroyers and cruisers formed an impenetrable line, repelling attack after attack with ruthless efficiency. The relentless pounding from both air and sea took its toll. Japanese bases, once strongholds of power, were reduced to ruins. Fuel shortages crippled their ability to launch large-scale naval operations, and their once advanced aircraft became obsolete in the face of American innovation. The empire that had once ruled the Pacific was now being forced into retreat, unable to withstand the onslaught of American firepower. With each victory, the United States solidified its grip on the Pacific. The strategy of island hopping allowed them to bypass heavily fortified positions, isolating enemy forces and rendering them powerless. Japanese soldiers left behind were cut off from their homeland, struggling to survive in deteriorating conditions. Supplies dwindled, morale plummeted, and their once unshakable confidence turned into desperation. The destruction of Japan's naval and air forces signaled an irreversible shift in the war. No longer able to dictate the course of battle, their commanders were forced into a defensive posture, reacting instead of leading. The once feared Japanese war machine had been dismantled piece by piece, leaving them vulnerable to the relentless advance of American forces. The Pacific, once a battlefield of uncertainty, was now firmly under the control of the United States, paving the way for the next phase of the war. The sound of gunfire echoed across the island as American troops advanced through dense jungles and rocky terrain. Each step forward was met with fierce resistance from Japanese defenders, who had fortified their positions with bunkers, tunnels, and hidden artillery. The battlefield was unforgiving, filled with traps, snipers, and the constant threat of ambushes. Despite these obstacles, the Americans pushed ahead, determined to take control of every stronghold. The Japanese had been ordered to fight to the last man. Surrender was not an option, and their determination made every engagement brutal. They launched sudden attacks under the cover of darkness, using guerrilla tactics to slow the enemy's progress. Machine gun fire erupted from hidden positions, forcing American soldiers to take cover before launching counteroffensives. Grenades and mortars exploded across the battlefield, turning the landscape into a chaotic war zone. American forces, however, had learned how to combat these tactics. With superior firepower and well-coordinated strategies, they systematically dismantled enemy defenses. Tanks rolled forward, crushing obstacles and blasting through barriers. Artillery rained down on fortified positions, forcing defenders to retreat or face annihilation. Engineers worked tirelessly to clear paths through the jungle, removing mines and cutting through barbed wire. Every inch gained was hard-fought, but the Americans refused to be stopped. Close-quarters combat became a grim reality for soldiers on both sides. In the heat of battle, hand-to-hand encounters were common. Bayonets clashed, knives flashed, and fists struck as men fought desperately to survive. The intensity of the fighting left no room for hesitation. Those who faltered for even a moment risked losing their lives. The courage and endurance of the troops were tested daily as they engaged in some of the most grueling battles of the war. Despite their resilience, the Japanese forces were slowly being overwhelmed. Their supply lines had been severed, leaving them with dwindling ammunition and food. Starvation and exhaustion took their toll, weakening even the most determined fighters. Many resorted to desperate measures, launching suicide charges in a final attempt to inflict damage. These reckless assaults, though courageous, often ended in devastating losses, as American machine gunners cut down waves of attackers before they could reach their targets. For the Americans, each victory brought them closer to their ultimate goal. Capturing key positions allowed them to establish bases from which they could launch further offensives. Airstrips were quickly constructed, enabling bombers to strike deeper into enemy territory. With every secured island, the path to Japan became clearer. The psychological impact of the relentless advance weighed heavily on the defenders. What had once been an empire of conquest had turned into a nation on the defensive, fighting a war it could no longer win. Messages intercepted from Japanese commanders revealed the desperation spreading among their ranks. Soldiers who had once believed in victory now faced the harsh reality of defeat. Yet, even as the situation worsened, surrender remained unthinkable for many. The deep-rooted belief in honor and sacrifice drove them to fight on, even when all hope was lost. Some chose to take their own lives rather than be captured, believing it to be a more honorable fate. Others continued to resist in small pockets long after their main forces had been wiped out. American troops, though victorious, paid a heavy price for every island won. Casualties were high, and the brutal conditions took a toll on their spirits. The relentless combat, the sight of fallen comrades, and the constant pressure of war tested their endurance. Yet they remained steadfast, knowing that each battle brought them closer to ending the war. As the final strongholds fell, the Japanese grip on the Pacific was shattered. Their army, once feared, had been broken. The battles had shown the world the determination of the American military and the resilience of its soldiers. Victory was within reach, and the road to Japan was now open. The war was far from over, but the outcome was becoming clearer with each passing day. The battlefield had fallen silent, but the scars of war remained. Smoke still rose from the ruins of once fortified positions, and the ground was littered with the remnants of a shattered army. The Japanese forces, once dominant in the Pacific, had suffered staggering losses. What had begun as an ambitious campaign to expand their empire had turned into a desperate struggle for survival. Now, with their military weakened and their defenses crumbling, the reality of defeat could no longer be ignored. For American troops, each victory had come at a cost. The relentless battles, the harsh conditions, and the unwavering resistance had pushed them to their limits. Yet, despite the hardships, they had pressed forward, knowing that their sacrifices were paving the way for an end to the war. Every island secured brought them closer to Japan itself, and with the enemy's navy and air force in ruins, The path was finally clear. News of the defeats spread quickly through the Japanese ranks. Commanders who had once spoken of glory and victory now faced the grim truth that their forces could no longer hold out. Supplies had been cut off, and reinforcements were non-existent. Factories back home struggled to produce weapons and ammunition, while American bombers relentlessly pounded cities and industrial centers. The empire that had once seemed unstoppable was now on the verge of collapse. Despite the overwhelming odds, Japan's leadership refused to surrender. They urged their remaining forces to fight on, clinging to the hope that something, anything, could turn the tide. But hope alone could not stop the inevitable. Every strategy they attempted was countered. Every defense they built was torn apart. The weight of the war had become too much to bear. For those still fighting on the front lines, the situation was dire. Many soldiers had gone days without food or medical supplies. Wounded men lay in makeshift shelters, knowing help would never come. Some continued to fight with whatever weapons they could find, while others, realizing the futility of resistance, simply waited for the end. The once proud army of Japan had been reduced to scattered remnants, unable to change the course of history. As American forces secured the final strongholds, the reality of their achievement set in. The war in the Pacific, which had claimed so many lives, was reaching its final chapter. Yet, even with victory in sight, there was little celebration. The destruction, the suffering, and the sheer scale of the conflict weighed heavily on those who had fought through it. They had won, but the cost had been immense. Back in Japan, the government faced a choice. They could continue to resist, knowing it would lead to total devastation, or they could surrender and bring the war to an end. For a nation that had built its identity on strength and perseverance, the idea of surrender was unthinkable. But as American bombers flew overhead, dropping destruction upon their cities, the pressure mounted. The empire was crumbling, and the world was watching to see what would happen next. The battles that had raged across the Pacific had not only changed the course of the war, but had also reshaped the future. The Japanese military, once feared for its discipline and effectiveness, had been defeated. The American forces had proven their strength, showing the world that they would not back down until victory was secured. The cost had been high, but the goal had been achieved. As the final days of the war approached, one thing became clear. Japan's time as an imperial power had come to an end. The once mighty empire, which had sought to dominate the Pacific, now stood on the brink of total collapse. The American forces, having fought their way across countless battlefields, had ensured that the sacrifices made were not in vain. The war was not over yet, but its conclusion was no longer in doubt. The weight of the war pressed heavily on Japan. With every battle lost, the hope of victory faded into the past. The empire that had once seemed invincible was now a shadow of itself, battered and broken. Its military had been dismantled, its navy reduced to scattered remnants, and its air force nearly wiped out. The American advance had been relentless, pushing ever closer to the Japanese homeland. The once vast Pacific battlefield had narrowed to a single, inescapable reality. Japan was on the brink of total defeat. In the cities, civilians faced the devastating consequences of a war that could no longer be won. Bombing raids turned entire neighborhoods into rubble, firestorms consumed homes, and families huddled in shelters, hoping to survive another night. Factories, once bustling with the production of weapons and supplies, lay in ruins. Food shortages worsened, and despair spread as people realized there was no path forward that did not end in destruction. Yet surrender remained a forbidden word, buried beneath a sense of duty and honor that had been ingrained for generations. The remaining Japanese soldiers, stationed on scattered islands and in defensive positions on the mainland, awaited orders that they knew would likely mean their deaths. They had seen comrades fall, leaders perish, and entire divisions wiped out. Yet, even in the face of overwhelming odds, they prepared to fight on, believing that honor demanded they resist until the very end. Some whispered that surrender was inevitable, but voicing such thoughts meant risking execution. Others held onto the belief that a final stand could somehow turn the tide. But the tide had already turned. The American forces, now fully in control of the Pacific, had proven their dominance. The island-hopping campaign had worked to perfection, bypassing strongholds that no longer held strategic value and cutting off the enemy's ability to sustain itself. Without resources, without reinforcements, and without a fleet to protect them, Japan stood isolated, waiting for the final blow. That blow came not in the form of another island invasion or naval assault, but from the sky. The war had already demonstrated the devastating power of air superiority, but nothing had prepared the world for what was to come. The first atomic bomb fell on Hiroshima, unleashing destruction unlike anything seen before. Entire sections of the city were obliterated in an instant, buildings vanished, and tens of thousands of lives were lost in a blinding flash of fire. Those who survived the initial blast faced unbearable suffering from burns, radiation sickness, and the complete collapse of their world. Even after such devastation, Japan hesitated. There was still a belief, among some in the military and government, that fighting on was the only option. But that belief was shattered when a second bomb fell on Nagasaki, delivering yet another wave of unimaginable destruction. In the span of days, the war had reached its breaking point. There was no longer any doubt. Resistance would only lead to the complete annihilation of the nation. Finally, the moment that had once seemed impossible arrived. Japan's leadership, faced with the certainty of total ruin, accepted the inevitable. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito addressed the nation, his voice solemn as he announced Japan's surrender. It was the first time many citizens had ever heard their emperor speak, and his words carried the weight of an entire era coming to an end. He spoke of the new and most cruel bomb that had forced their decision, but also of the need to endure the unendurable to ensure the survival of Japan. For the soldiers who had fought so fiercely, the news was met with disbelief, sorrow, and in some cases, relief. Some refused to accept it, choosing to take their own lives rather than surrender. Others laid down their weapons in silence, unable to comprehend that the war they had given everything for was over. In the United States and among its allies, celebrations erupted. The war that had consumed the world for years had finally come to an end. Victory had been secured, and the fighting was over. But while the war ended, the scars it left behind would never fully heal. Cities lay in ruins, families were shattered, and the memories of those lost could never be erased. Japan, once an empire built on conquest, was now a defeated nation, facing an uncertain future. American forces moved in, not as invaders but as occupiers, tasked with rebuilding what had been destroyed. General Douglas MacArthur led the effort to reshape Japan, guiding it toward democracy and a new way of life. In time, the nation would rise from the ashes, transformed into something entirely different from what it had been before the war. But for those who had lived through the conflict, the echoes of battle would never fully fade. The world had changed, and the lessons of war would remain etched in history. The Pacific, once a battleground of fire and blood, had finally found peace. The war was over, and with it came the dawn of a new era.